Excuse me. Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to see everybody. Everybody was able to get up out of bed this morning.
It's nice when your watches and phones all change themselves.
All right. We've got Bill and Sandy and Linda's joining us. She's not feeling well, but Bill and Sandy are on with us as well this morning. Are there any updates or prayer requests or announcements? Did find out my Uncle Ted is home. He didn't get to go home until Wednesday afternoon because they were watching his blood tests in regards to the infection. It wasn't the surgery that was delaying him. It was they didn't obviously want to send him home and have the sepsis reflare or anything like that. But seems to be doing well. Of course, and if you've never known anyone who's had their gallbladder removed, it's a relatively interesting shift in dietary requirements because it's attached to the liver and it has to do with the way your body processes all that stuff. So can affect your diet. So he's got some long-term adjustments to make as well. So prayers appreciated, but other than regards to the infection and the surgery, he seems to be doing okay. David has his toes operated on this Friday. I haven't heard about Beth. I know she had the one eye done and was doing okay.
They said they'll be here for worship, and Carolyn sent the same message that they'll be here for worship.
Okay.
But they'll be online for class, I think is what they said.
Okay. Did you have something? Steve and Penny are traveling this weekend. All right. Well, let's go ahead and begin with a word of prayer. Our Lord and Father, we are grateful. We are thankful for all the blessings that you give us through your Son. We're thankful for our church family here, for the strength that we can draw on one another. We're thankful for some of our members who have been able to come through some things and health-wise and surgeries and things, and we're thankful, Father, for those folks being restored to us. We're mindful of those that are traveling right now and ask that you keep them safe and bring them back to us. We pray, Father, as we enter into our study this morning, that you'll help us and encourage us in our better understanding. Father, grant us the wisdom that we need to better understand what it is to worship you. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, so as I mentioned last week, we've been talking about how there's a much larger view of worship in the New Testament than, for example, Sundays. Worship in not just the New Testament, but also in the Old Testament, is something that is much bigger than you can encapsulate even in a single day, much less in just a few hours. That being said, we don't ever want to necessarily diminish the idea of the assembling together. And I actually like what Brother Ferguson says here. He says, if one can sustain their faith without the support of common worship, then it is not the Christian faith they hold. Because again, the church, what was Jesus's statement when Peter confessed that he was the Christ, the Son of the living God? What did Jesus promise to do? Build his church. He didn't say, I plan to have an individual relationship with everybody. Now he does, but he said, I'm going to build the church. The church is always intended to be an integral part of what it is to have the Christian faith. And so again, we have to have those times when the church comes together. And there's several terms that are used in our New Testaments. There is come together, which is sunerkomai. Then there's gather together, which is synago, which is the verb form where we get the word synagogue. There is the assembly or assembling, synathorizo, and then being in the same place, which is just a phrase, but that phrase is used to speak of when the church gathered, not just, for example, if everybody lived in Ashland, we'd all be in the same place, but that's not what they're meaning, right? And you might notice that most of those words start with the prefix sin, and that doesn't actually make them all related words. They are actually, all three of those are entirely different words. That's a Greek prefix meaning to come. So that's why they all kind of start with that. In English, it would be an SYN. Again, it's a prefix that's added to all of those words. But again, the idea is to come together, gather together, or to assemble are really the big three. And obviously different words can also be thrown in by different translators and things. But there is an emphasis, and we're going to be looking especially at some passages in the book of Acts, because that's where we see a lot of examples of the Christian worship assembly, as we might call it. So, for example, if we go to Acts chapter 10, and can somebody read Acts chapter 10, verses 24 through 27, please?
The following day he arrived in Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them, and he called together his relatives and close friends. As Peter entered the house, Cornelius met him and fell at his feet in reverence. But Peter made him get up. "Stand up," he said. "I am only a man myself." While talking with him, Peter went inside and found a large gathering of people.
All right, so that large gathering of people, as the NIV puts it, is our assembling together. And so again, the emphasis here is that while Cornelius had called his friends, right, we're told that he called them, they actually did gather in his home. And this is one of those terms, this coming together, or assembling here. Many people were assembled there to hear what Peter had to say. And again, this isn't really a Christian worship, because except for Peter and his companions, nobody in the room was Christians. But again, that's the reason I'm showing you this is, again, this is another one of those instances where these are words that were already used. For example, the one that I mentioned is the same word as synagogue. They were already being used, but they took on special meaning when used by especially the New Testament writers to describe our worship, our gathering to worship. We see something similar, for example, in Acts chapter 16, where it speaks of the women assembling together to pray in Philippi. But let's look at a passage that actually is in reference to an actual Christian assembling together, and let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 14. And if somebody could read verse 26 for us, please.
What is the outcome then, brethren, when you assemble? Each one has a psalm, has a teaching, has a revelation, has a tongue, has an interpretation. Let all things be done for edification.
Thank you. So from this, when they come together and assemble together, and they have these various songs or speeches or whatever, what's the ultimate outcome for the church? Edification. All right, so first and foremost, as we've already discussed, worship in a general sense is about giving praise and his due, the due worship that God is worthy of just because he's God, but then the assembling together, and again, that type of worship, you can sing a song in your head by yourself, and you're praising, you're worshiping. You can have an individualized moment of worship, or what have you. But again, when there's the assembling together, one of the primary goals of the assembly is the edification, the building up of the church. And I'm not a huge fan of the word edification, if I'm honest, because we don't use the term edification. It's kind of one of those words that got thrown in to our Bibles and is kind of just stuck around. But it's not a word that your average person is going to know. If you just walked out to somebody who's not a Bible reader, hasn't been to church, and you said, hey, why don't you come over here? We're having a worship this morning and we want to edify you. They're going to look at you like, you want to do what to me? But again, this idea of edification, again, it's not a bad word or a wrong word or anything. It's one of those words that it's what I like to call a church word. We kind of get used to hearing it. We already maybe know what it means, but when we're talking to people who aren't churchy people, which, if let's face it, in the area that we live, a lot of them are non-churchy people. It's kind of one of those words that it's going to be like, what is that? And it doesn't convey, I think, even maybe for a younger Christian or a newer Christian who, they may not understand what that is. And so I think it's worth some time to, talk about that it just means the building up, the strengthening. Its base is kind of in a construction, right? Even as we use today the term edifice to talk about something, that is kind of grandiosely built. I always go back to some of the walled cities, right? And how some of the walls on those cities were literally meters thick, right? And that's an edification to their city. It's a building up, it's a strengthening. That's what the church, that's what the assembling, that's what gathering with other Christians is supposed to do for us, is it helps us have our strength, our walls, if you, so to speak. We don't want to put walls up and block people out, but again, it's about strengthening, right, our hearts. I go back to the idea of how in the book of Job, right, Satan accuses God, well, you've built a hedge around him. Yeah, absolutely. Well, coming together, assembling as the church is about doing hedge maintenance, making sure there's no holes in it, making sure it's going to keep what needs to keep out. And that's what it comes down to, is it's designed to get us through another week. Because, by Saturday, by the end of the week, there's a good chance that something has happened to us that's probably trying to wear us down. I had to do taxes yesterday. Nope, not anywhere on my top 1,000 list of things to do. I'd rather have a root canal, and I am perfectly honest on that. I've had several. Taxes are less enjoyable. It's one of those things. Stuff like that, just everyday life, and it doesn't necessarily have to be something majorly catastrophic, but you get enough of those things that are just draining, it weakens us, and it makes us more susceptible to things. And so gathering together, that's kind of the, we're going to focus a lot on, as we talk about these things, and as the New Testament, it talks almost exclusively about those meetings being on Sunday, because that's the only requirement to the New Testament. Now, that's not to say that our midweek Bible studies are a bad thing at all. I don't think they are. I think they're a very good thing. But we need to also kind of have this mentality, this understanding that there's something that we have added, not that it's wrong, but we have built a tradition that helps in that strengthening, but it's not a requirement.
Well, we could do more.
Yeah.
Because when the church first began, it meant daily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have lots of examples, especially in the book of Acts when a church started, that it speaks of them gathering together on a regular basis in each other's homes, sharing meals together on regular bases. And again, not that it was necessarily the entire congregation, right? I think about, for example, the very first church in Jerusalem. I really doubt all 3,000 to 5,000 of them were getting together every day, right? And of course, there's also the understanding, and even Paul, at times, even while he was working as a missionary, had to work, right? So again, there's an understanding there, and we also cannot forget that most of the church were made from not the aristocracy. Probably a large portion were even slaves. Well, guess where they had to be on a daily basis? They had to be at work because they didn't even have a choice about it, right? And so, again, it's not always that the entirety of the congregation was getting together, but they did seek out one another. They did seek those opportunities to draw upon one another for, again, that strengthening and that encouragement. But I just wanted to point that out, that we are going to focus primarily when the New Testament, when our Bibles are talking about Christian assembly, it's almost exclusively on Sunday. Now, another thing that we have kind of traditionalized and things is that the meeting has to be on Sunday morning. No. There's no indication of time anywhere in Scripture. That's one of those things that is very much up to the local congregation. And I've had the opportunity to work with congregations at times where, especially if there's a relatively small number, and especially in the circumstance where maybe there's not very many men, I've seen a lot of those congregations shift, for example, to a single service on a Sunday afternoon so that maybe a local preacher can come help them out. Because, of course, if they're having services at 10 o'clock, where are probably all of the local preachers? At their congregations. Right? So, again, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's, I've also, both before but especially after COVID, I've seen a big shift with a lot of congregations moving away from Sunday evening services altogether. Largely because with the advent of things like Zoom or other streaming services, if somebody's unable to attend in person, they can still be aware, right? They can, like, for example, we stream. It's one of the reasons that I prefer to stream our entire worship as opposed to just the sermons. Some congregations do that, and I don't have a problem with that. That's not like you have to do it one way or the other. But I think by streaming our entire service, it creates a more integrated, feel to things. But again, I've seen some people push back against that idea, even maybe claiming that a congregation who does away with an evening or an afternoon service is somehow weakened. Nope. Because realistically, when you look at our examples in the New Testament, it probably wasn't just an hour that they were there. Now, that being said, we have to be careful when we look at the book of Acts, because remember, Paul was a missionary. So when Paul came into town, it was kind of a big deal. It would be not dissimilar to, in modern terms, of us having like a gospel meeting or a tent revival or something of that nature, where there tends to be a lot more preaching going on during an event like that, right? And it's not always just on Sundays and things like that nature. So again, we have to be a little bit, aware that what's sometimes described in the book of Acts and in our New Testaments is not always exemplary of a standard Sunday. For example, I think of the time that Paul was preaching and the young man fell asleep at midnight. By the way, Paul then started preaching again, and he preached until dawn. So the preaching at midnight, he only stopped because the guy fell out of the window and died, and he had to revive him. Okay, Paul didn't stop preaching. He continued to preach until daybreak when he had to leave. How many of us really want to have every single Sunday service, though, go all night long until the dawn? Okay. So again, those are very special circumstances. And it's largely because, an apostle came into town. So if I have an opportunity, I'm going to sit there and listen as much as I can, right? But again, we do have an indication, not only from the New Testament, but probably the stronger evidence to this is some of what we would call the church fathers or early Christian writers who were not inspired. Probably best way to look at them, they're often called church fathers because that's the term that the larger religious community uses it. They're early commentators is what they are. Okay? And they did their commentating not in books like what we're used to, but they did it in letters because that's the medium that they used. The idea of books as we know them, like this, really didn't come about until the late 2nd century, till about 150 to 170 was putting things together in books like this, really common practice. And they're called codexes, or codifying. Prior to that, a lot of it was just scrolls and things like that, and letters, and you just have this collection of them to use. So again, we have to be careful about taking too much, but we also, I think, have a responsibility that, to make our worship assemblies, to make our coming together, what it's about. And again, it's about not only offering praise to God and things, but also building up one another. And I do think that there are times that our modern church is a little too aggressive on the clock. Now, that being said, I know, for example, the congregation, I don't know if they're still doing it, but I know like the congregation where Greg and LaDawn are at in Lubbock, at least they used to, like back when I was in school of preaching, on Sunday mornings, they did a live radio broadcast of their worship. Well, that means that it had to start at X time and had to be done by X time because they only had 45 minutes or whatever of airtime. Okay, that's okay. Yeah. I think that's a great thing. I think now with things like YouTube and other things like that, of course, we can upload a 4-hour-long video if we want, right? It's not, we're not as bound by the clock there, but I do think that, we could stand to be a little more fluid on things. I think in a lot of ways the church, especially in the United States, has kind of trapped itself into some traditions that aren't necessarily bad, but I think we should always question something when the reason we do it is because that's the way we've always done it. That's a really bad reason to do anything, ever. Not just for the church, in your own life, that's a really bad reason to do anything. So we see the church, again, coming together, and as Paul points out here in 1 Corinthians 14, our primary reason is for this edification. If we go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, we actually see Paul there use a couple of these different terms in relatively the same space here. Can somebody read 1 Corinthians 11 verses 18 through 20?
For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that divisions exist among you. And in part, I believe it. For there must also be factions among you, so that those who are approved may become evident among you. Therefore, when you meet together, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in your eating, each one takes his own supper first, and one is hungry and another is drunk. What? Do you not have houses in which to eat and drink? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? In this I will not praise you.
Thank you. So there in verse 18, he says, when you come together as a church, that's our assembling together. But then in verse 20, when he says when you meet together, that's a different word. And he specifies there when you come together in one place. And so again, he's using these terms. And I don't think there's any like major theological, he used this one here because he's trying to emphasize. It's just to show that while there are different words used, they basically mean the same thing. And it is interesting that he changes it up here. He uses one term in one spot and another in another. But again, the emphasis is that they're coming together as a church. They're coming together, here specifically, speaking of the Lord's Supper, which we'll have a whole discussion on that. But the Lord's Supper is one of the few things that we do as Christians in worship that is exclusively communal. That is, it is intended to always be done with the church. Now, with our modern things, I don't necessarily always think that that means we all have to literally be in the exact same spot, but again, that it's done in a unified fashion. And I mean that especially for those that are gathering with us online, for example. I don't think that invalidates them partaking of the Lord's Supper at home when they take it along with us or anything of that nature. But it is one of the few things that is intended to always be done communally. Hence the name. Okay, so let's look at some other passages here. Let's go back to the book of Acts. This time let's go to Acts chapter 14. Bill says we always partake in concert with you at the building. Yeah, and I mean that's another one of the reasons that I think the technology, has definitely is a strengthening aspect to it. Is that even if we're separated, we can still do it together, so to speak. Okay, so Acts chapter 14. If somebody could read verses 26 through 28, please.
And from there they sailed to Antioch, from which they had been, commended to the grace of God for the work that they had accomplished. And when they had arrived and gathered the church together, they began to report all things that God had done with them and how he opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. And they spent a long time with the disciples.
Thank you. So this is the close of the first missionary journey. Paul and Barnabas and whoever else may have been traveling with them returned back to Antioch, where they started out at. All three of Paul's missionary journeys began in Antioch, and the first two ended there. The third ended in Jerusalem. Or I guess you could argue that it ended in Rome, since he was arrested in Jerusalem, and that's what led to his whole deportation to Rome. But it's generally considered that the third missionary journey ended in Jerusalem. But here, as they return back to Antioch, they again gather the church together. This is, again, just our word being used here. Not necessarily a Sunday assembly like what we think, but again, a term that's used, that they gathered the church together to hear this report from Paul and Barnabas of how things went. And then again, that emphasis in verse 28 that they spent a long time with the disciples, that they there is Paul and Barnabas, indicating that essentially Paul and Barnabas stayed home for a while in between the first and second missionary journeys. Not necessarily meaning that the staying together was all day, all night when they got back. But again, this is one of those terms that's gathering, has a much broader terminology, even at times here when it's used in gathering the church together. But again, the emphasis is that unifying spirit of them joining. We see in chapter 15, we see the same word used about what's sometimes referred to as the Jerusalem Council. I'm not a huge fan of that terminology, but I don't know a better thing to describe it as. But they also there speak of the apostles and elders and others coming together to talk about the issues that the church was facing, specifically here regarding the Judaizers. But let's go to Acts chapter 20. And if somebody could read verses 6 and 7, please.
But we sailed from Philippi after the festival of unleavened bread, and 5 days later joined the others at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, kept on talking until midnight.
All right. So here, this is another of the missionary journeys, and they've returned back to Troas from Philippi. Why would they wait 7 days? Why would they wait an entire week there? To meet with the church. So what it sounds like is they got into town on Sunday, but they missed the assembly. Because again, it took them 5 days travel time, because traveling in those days was not, it wasn't road construction and things. It was sometimes a storm on the Mediterranean Sea that could blow you off course or very much affect those things. But again, they specifically waited an entire week so that they could gather with the church. And I don't think that, here Paul and Silas were just like huddled away, not having anything to do with anybody in the church, but they wanted to make sure that they could be there when the majority of the church was going to gather again on Sunday. And so again, this is this gathering, and again, the emphasis here on the first day of the week is when the church gathered to itself. So again, ultimately, the reason why we wanted to look at these words wasn't because there's any major theological thing, but to emphasize that it's always been, since the church was begun, it's always been a necessity, it's always been a core principle for the church to gather together. And maybe even more specifically, as we see here in Acts chapter 20, that the church gathers together on the first day of the week. Most specifically, not exclusively, but most specifically, that gathering on the first day of the week is a core principle, one of those things that we cannot set aside. Okay. So now as we talk about, we're going to start talking a little bit about what that assembly is. Okay? So let's just start by asking the question. What do we usually consider the assembly to be? Not necessarily the acts of worship, but we've already looked at some of the purposes. But what are maybe some other purposes or some other things that we can think of that the assembly is good for?
Well, you don't like to use that word, but you said edification. I think
Yeah,
we
no, edification. I don't hate the word. There's nothing wrong with the word. I just don't like words that the average person isn't always going to just be able to pick the definition out of the air.
But I think more of us that are here on the first day of the week, the happier I am. Singing sounds a little bit better, just good all the way around. And then on a gorgeous day like today too, that even complements it.
Okay. Yeah. So that building up. Anything else?
Learn what's going on with each other.
Okay.
Well, we just learned
The-
the disciples came together to break bread.
The sharing, the sharing. Yeah, the sharing of burdens is a big one. We have it a lot easier, right? If something's going on, we can text each other, call each other. They didn't have that for most of history, right? I mean, we haven't really even had that for much more than about 30 years. uh, so, yeah, one of the biggest things for the assembly was to, let each other know, make prayer requests, offer those prayers for people. And yeah, as Rebecca pointed out, partaking of the Lord's Supper, performing the acts of worship, which we'll talk about in more detail there. But
one of the things it does is remind us we're not alone, because even with the technology of online stuff, you don't necessarily reach out to all of your friends or family on a daily basis necessarily. And even if you do reach out to certain people on a daily basis, it's not necessarily that they're also Christians who can support you the same way as a local congregation.
yeah, absolutely, we need that support and that reminder that we're not doing this alone. Human beings are social beings. Now, that doesn't mean we all appreciate large social gatherings. It doesn't mean we all like crowds or anything of that nature, but pretty much everybody agrees that it's not healthy to be entirely alone all of the time, right? Even if you're not a huge fan of people, you got to look at another person every once in a while to just be mentally healthy, okay? And you got to have some interactions. And that doesn't have to be small talk. It doesn't have to be those types of things. But again, we need that social interaction for general health. And I think in that social interaction, one of the things that the church does is it encourages social interaction across all of those boundaries that the world likes to set up for us. You look at a church, and there's people from the most early stages of life to the last stages of life. You've often got people from a myriad of backgrounds, both socially, economically, culturally. You've got a number of people who, have a lot of different things, and the church brings those people together and encourages, again, discourse and things that, not that it wouldn't necessarily otherwise be possible, but it probably wouldn't happen, right? I have a lot of wonderful friends that I would have no connection with them whatsoever were it not for the church. Because at one point maybe we lived in entirely different parts of the country, or maybe now we do, but we still have that connection because we can reach out and all of these things, or even in other parts of the world for that matter. There's also the idea, especially when we consider the fact that the early church didn't have things like cell phones, that when they found out about a need, that was going to be the time when the majority of the church was together, that they could plan and then act on a need, right? We see this, for example, in Acts chapter 6, when there was an identification that there were some widows who needed help, right? The church came together, said, okay, we're going to find some people, pick some people to take care of this, and then take care of this, and then we're going to send them out to take care of it. The church was able to do that when it was together. Again, nowadays we can do some of that stuff. If, somebody says something about a need, well, we can call each other, text each other, and we can, do some of that stuff without necessarily having to all be in the same spot. But at the same time, it's texting and all that's been a thing, but at the same time, in every single church that I've ever been a part of over the last 25 years or so of being a Christian, Sunday mornings were still the time that most of the updates, news, and stuff got done. It's just, again, it's a natural time as the church is there together to lean upon one another and also to then be that support to each other.
We can worship God together, as opposed to, like you said, by ourselves.
Yeah, and a unified worship, absolutely. Jesus often speaks of public prayer in a negative light, but what he's speaking about there is not public prayer like what we experience in a time of worship. He's speaking about somebody who is publicly praying their own prayer, if that makes sense. So often what we see pictured there is somebody standing on a street corner praying to God loudly, specifically to make other people listen to what they're praying, as opposed to praying with other people in a public environment. There's two vastly different things. So again, even that, that community praying together, singing together. Again, you can sing by yourself, but it's different when there's dozens, or if you've ever had the opportunity, hundreds of voices, lifting themselves up to God. It's a different experience, right? And so again, that joining together. Okay, so we are basically out of time for this morning, but we will continue to look at this idea of the day of assembly and get into some more specifics about what happens on that day. For example, what the New Testament has to say about that in the coming weeks. All right. Thank you very much.
Thinking about it all week, this is so crazy. But I think these things this morning.
I almost left it out.
they were